Trust was the deadliest contract I ever signed.
I'm a software developer who dropped out of college to pursue an idea that everyone told me was crazy. I had this vision for an encryption system that could revolutionize cybersecurity, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I didn't build it immediately, someone else would. So I left school, despite everyone saying I was throwing my future away. That's when I met Derek, who would become my business partner and eventually one of the two people who would betray me in the worst way possible. Derek was everything I wasn't. He understood finance, knew how to talk to investors, could navigate corporate politics like a professional. I was the technical genius who could code for 18 hours straight, but couldn't explain a balance sheet to save my life. We were perfect complements to each other. I'd build the actual technology, and he'd handle all the business operations, fundraising, investor relations, everything I had zero interest in dealing with. We decided to call our company TechShield, and we started it in literally a converted garage that barely had heating. Those early days were absolutely brutal. Derek and I would pull all-nighters constantly, surviving on terrible coffee and cheap takeout food, writing the first iterations of our encryption software. We'd debug code until our eyes crossed, then wake up and do it again. But we were building something incredible together, and we became genuinely close friends during that time. I trusted Derek with everything, told him personal things I didn't share with anyone else, and let him handle entire aspects of the business that I never even reviewed. That complete trust would eventually become the weapon he used to destroy me. During those struggling early years, when we were barely keeping TechShield afloat, I met Jennifer. She was intelligent, supportive, and most importantly, she believed in me when I had nothing to show for my efforts except mountains of debt and a half-finished software prototype. We'd celebrate the tiniest victories together, like when we finally got our first minor investor. We bought cheap wine and drank it in my tiny apartment, while she told me I was destined for greatness. I fell completely in love with her. She wasn't dating me for money because I was broke. She wasn't impressed by status because I had none. She was just there for me, supporting my dream when it seemed completely insane to everyone else. Or at least, that's what I believed at the time. We got married right around the time TechShield started gaining serious traction. I thought I'd found my life partner, the person who would stand beside me no matter what happened. For a while, everything seemed perfect. Derek was handling the business side brilliantly. Jennifer was supporting me emotionally and eventually got involved with the company, using her legal background to help with contracts and acquisitions, and I was free to focus entirely on what I loved, building and improving our encryption technology. Fast forward 5 years. TechShield had become a massive success story, the kind of company that gets written about in business magazines. We were worth over $1 billion. We had contracts with major banking institutions, government agencies, Fortune 500 corporations. The encryption software I developed was considered state-of-the-art technology, virtually impenetrable, the gold standard in the industry. I was incredibly proud of what we'd accomplished, but I stayed in my lane. I loved coding, improving systems, solving complex technical problems, all the corporate stuff, the board meetings, investor presentations, strategic planning. I was happy to let Derek handle it. Jennifer had also become deeply involved in TechShield's operations, and I thought having my wife and best friend running things while I focused on innovation was the ideal arrangement. But over time, small things started bothering me, little details that didn't quite add up. Jennifer would take late-night conference calls about supposed business acquisitions, but when I'd ask for details, she'd be vague and change the subject. Derek started suggesting more frequently that I should really just focus purely on development and let them handle absolutely everything else. Board votes would go in directions that surprised me, decisions being made that I didn't fully understand. Whenever I'd express concern, they'd both reassure me that everything was fine, that I was overthinking things, that I should just trust them and keep doing what I did best. And because I wanted to believe them, because they were my wife and my closest friend, I pushed my doubts aside and went back to writing code. Then came that Thursday morning that changed everything. I'll remember every detail of that day for the rest of my life. I was sitting in my office, the office in the building that I'd helped design from the ground up, when Jennifer walked in with Derek following right behind her. She was carrying a thick folder of legal documents, and she had this expression on her face that I'd never seen before. It was cold, calculated, almost triumphant. She dropped the papers on my desk with a heavy thud and said, "Congratulations, I was officially unemployed." I just stared at her, not comprehending what she was saying. She continued, explaining that the company I'd built from absolutely nothing was no longer mine. The board of directors had voted me out in a decision that was already finalized. TechShield now belonged to her and Derek. They were taking over everything. And if I even thought about fighting this legally, their lawyers would ensure I walked away with absolutely nothing. Not just nothing from the company, but nothing from our marriage, nothing from years of work. Complete destruction. Derek stood there with the most infuriating, smug expression I'd ever seen on a human face. His arms were crossed like some conquering general surveying the ruins of a defeated enemy. He made some comment about how this must really hurt, losing everything to him, being the one walking out of the building with a cardboard box while he took over my entire life's work. This was the same guy I'd spent countless sleepless nights with building TechShield from nothing. The person I'd confided in about my deepest fears and biggest dreams. Jennifer was somehow even worse, though. She brought up how I'd dropped out of college, using it as a weapon against me, suggesting that maybe if I'd stayed in school, I would have learned how business actually works. This was the same woman who used to defend my decision to drop out when other people questioned it, who told me that formal education couldn't teach the kind of innovation I possessed. Now she was mocking me with it. She tapped the papers on my desk and told me very clearly not to even consider fighting this, that their legal team would obliterate me in court. The betrayal hit me in waves. This wasn't just professional. This was deeply, intimately personal. My wife and my best friend had been planning this for months, maybe longer. They'd been carefully positioning themselves, manipulating board members, consolidating power, making strategic moves while I was too focused on the technology to see the bigger picture of what they were orchestrating. They'd played me perfectly, used my trust and my passion for coding against me. But here's the thing they didn't know, the thing that would eventually destroy them. When you build cybersecurity software professionally, when you design systems meant to protect against sophisticated attacks, you think about threats constantly. You plan for worst-case scenarios. You build in fail-safes. Years earlier, when I'd first developed TechShield's core encryption framework, I'd embedded something deep in the code, a vulnerability so subtle and deeply buried that no regular security audit or code review would ever catch it. It wasn't obvious malware or a virus, nothing that crude. It was a design flaw, an intentional weakness built into the fundamental architecture that would remain completely dormant until very specific conditions triggered its activation. The way I'd designed this flaw was actually elegant in its simplicity. The system would function perfectly under normal conditions. Clients would install our software, encrypt their sensitive data, and trust that their information was completely protected. Everything would work exactly as advertised. But as clients scaled up their operations, adding more users, processing more data, expanding their systems, the encryption keys would begin duplicating incorrectly. It would start with minor issues, barely noticeable glitches that support teams would attribute to user error or configuration problems. But over time, over weeks and months, those small glitches would cascade into catastrophic failures. Encryption keys would mismatch, making it literally impossible to decrypt data. Entire databases full of critical information would become permanently unreadable. And here's the beautiful part. There was no fix. None. Because I was the only person alive who understood this flaw deeply enough to patch it correctly. As Jennifer and Derek stood there in my office, gloating about their victory, completely confident they'd outmaneuvered me, I casually reached for my laptop. It was still sitting on my desk, and more importantly, it was still logged into TechShield's internal systems. They hadn't thought to revoke my administrative access yet, which was an amateur mistake that would cost them everything. I flipped open the laptop, pulled up the back-end control panel, and typed in a single command. One keystroke activated the failsafe I'd embedded years ago as insurance against exactly this kind of scenario. The script was now running, invisible, unstoppable. I pressed enter, closed the laptop calmly, then stood up and picked up the cardboard box they'd prepared for me containing a few personal items from my office. I looked Derek directly in the eyes and told him to enjoy it while it lasted. His smug expression faltered slightly, confusion crossing his face, but I didn't give him any time to ask questions or process what I meant. I just turned and walked out of that office, out of the building, into the bright sunlight of a day that should have been the worst of my life. Walking to my car, carrying that pathetic cardboard box, should have been crushing. I should have felt humiliated, defeated, destroyed. But instead I felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. They thought they'd won completely, thought they'd taken everything from me and left me with nothing. but they had absolutely no idea what I just activated. They'd stolen a ticking time bomb and were too arrogant and ignorant to even realize it existed. I drove to my apartment, which was a modest place compared to the luxury penthouse Jennifer and I had shared. That penthouse was hers now. Part of the divorce settlement she'd apparently been planning for months before I even knew it was happening. But I didn't care about fancy apartments or expensive furniture. What mattered was my personal laptop, the one they hadn't confiscated, the one that contained all my backup files, documentation, and, most importantly, complete records of exactly how I'd built TechShield's systems. I spent the entire night reviewing my failsafe code, double-checking every line to make absolutely certain it would execute exactly as I'd designed it. I traced through the logic, verified the trigger conditions, confirmed the cascade sequence. Everything was perfect. By the time morning came, I was completely ready for phase 2 of what had now become my mission. Not just revenge, but complete reconstruction on my own terms. First thing that morning, I called Marcus. He was one of the senior engineers at TechShield, someone who'd been with me since nearly the beginning and had remained loyal through everything. Marcus told me that Derek was already making massive changes, gutting the research and development department, firing everyone who'd been close to me or who he perceived as potentially loyal to me. The people who'd managed to keep their jobs were terrified, walking on eggshells, afraid to say anything that might get them fired next. This was actually perfect for my purposes. If Derek was cutting staff that aggressively and that quickly, he'd be too distracted to notice what was missing from the codebase or what might be quietly wrong with the systems until it was far too late to do anything about it. Over the next couple weeks, I watched TechShield from the outside like a scientist observing an experiment. Small problems started appearing, minor glitches that their support team dismissed as user configuration errors or temporary network issues, client reports of files that wouldn't decrypt properly, security certificates that seemed slightly off, encryption processes taking longer than expected. Nothing catastrophic yet, nothing that would cause immediate panic, but I knew exactly what was coming because I'd designed every step of this cascade failure. Meanwhile, I wasn't just sitting around watching TechShield slowly implode. I was building something new, something better. I reached out to the engineers and staff who'd been fired or who'd quit in protest after my departure. Marcus was obviously the first person to join my new venture. Then, I contacted Elena, our former lead cryptographer, the brilliant woman who'd helped me develop some of TechShield's most sophisticated algorithms. She was absolutely furious about what Jennifer and Derek had done, called it the most unethical corporate betrayal she'd witnessed in 20 years in the industry. Next, I brought in Tony, our former security strategist. Tony was the guy who always asked the critical what-if questions that made our systems more robust, who could think like an attacker and find vulnerabilities before they became exploits. And finally, I recruited Rebecca, who'd worked in HR but was so much more than that. Rebecca had connections throughout the entire tech industry, understood corporate politics better than anyone I'd ever met, knew which investors were trustworthy and which ones would stab you in the back for a percentage point. We met at a quiet coffee shop in a part of the city where we wouldn't run into anyone from TechShield or the broader tech scene. I laid out my entire plan on the table in front of them. TechShield was going to fail catastrophically, and soon because Jennifer and Derek had stolen something they fundamentally didn't understand and couldn't maintain without me. But just watching them fail wasn't enough. We needed to build something to replace it, something that would rise from TechShield's ashes and completely dominate the cybersecurity market. I showed them the technical blueprints I'd been working on for a new system I was calling Cyber Fortress. It took everything I'd learned from building TechShield, all the successes and all the mistakes, and pushed the technology significantly further. I designed quantum-level encryption protocols that would make TechShield systems look primitive by comparison, like comparing a Model T to a Tesla. The architecture was more elegant, more secure, more scalable. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a complete revolution in how encryption systems could function. One by one, they committed to joining me. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, though that was certainly part of it. This was about building something that represented what TechShield should have been before greed and betrayal corrupted it. We were going to create a company built on actual loyalty, competence, and genuine innovation instead of corporate backstabbing. The work was incredibly intense. We rented a small office space, nothing fancy, and started pulling the same kind of all-nighters we'd done in TechShield's early days. But the energy was completely different now. We weren't naive kids chasing an uncertain dream. We were experienced professionals who knew exactly what we were building and why it mattered. Elena refined the cryptographic algorithms, making them more efficient and more secure. Tony stress-tested every possible vulnerability he could imagine, trying to break our systems before any attacker could. Rebecca started making careful strategic calls to investors and potential clients, laying groundwork for our eventual launch without tipping off Jennifer and Derek about what we were building. About 6 weeks after I'd been forced out, Marcus sent me an urgent message late at night. TechShield had just attempted to implement their system with a major new banking client, a significant expansion that would have been a huge win for them. And the failsafe was triggering exactly on schedule. I opened my laptop and accessed TechShield's back-end systems through a back door I'd maintained. Technically, I shouldn't have had access anymore. They should have locked me out of everything. But they'd been sloppy and overconfident in their rush to consolidate power. The error logs were absolutely beautiful to watch. Red text flooding across the screen, encryption failures cascading through their network in real time. The flaw was executing perfectly, exactly as I'd designed it. Clients were reporting that encrypted files wouldn't open. Security certificates were corrupting. Database queries were returning garbage data. Nothing catastrophic enough to immediately crash the entire system. That would have been too obvious, but enough to cause serious concern and trigger emergency troubleshooting sessions. I started monitoring TechShield's stock price obsessively. Over the next several days, it started dropping. Not a dramatic collapse, not yet, but a steady, concerning decline that spooked investors and triggered worried articles in tech industry publications. Jennifer and Derek called emergency board meetings. Marcus, who still had friends inside the company, kept me updated on the growing panic. They were bringing in expensive outside consultants to diagnose the problems, security experts who would examine the code and run diagnostics and write lengthy reports. But none of these consultants could figure out what was fundamentally wrong because the flaw was so deeply embedded and so subtle. They'd find surface-level issues and recommend patches and optimizations, but those fixes wouldn't address the core vulnerability because they didn't even know it existed. Then my phone started buzzing constantly. Jennifer calling. I stared at her name on the screen and let it go to voicemail. Then Derek called. I ignored him too. Then text messages started flooding in. Dozens of them. Jennifer demanding that I fix whatever I'd done to the system, threatening lawsuits, claiming she knew I'd sabotaged everything. Derek trying to sound reasonable and professional, suggesting we talk things through like adults, hinting that maybe we could work out some kind of deal. I didn't respond to any of them, let them panic and scramble, and slowly realize how completely screwed they were. TechShield's largest client, a multinational banking corporation that represented nearly 15% of their revenue, announced publicly that they were terminating their contract after experiencing multiple critical security failures. That was the trigger that turned a steady decline into absolute freefall. The stock price collapsed. More clients started pulling out, some quietly, others making public statements about losing confidence in TechShield's technology. The tech media picked up the story and ran with it. Industry blogs published articles with headlines like TechShield's Mysterious Technical Crisis and Has the Cybersecurity Giant Lost Its Edge? Analysts were questioning whether the company could survive, whether this was a temporary problem or a fundamental flaw in their entire approach. Everything I'd spent years carefully building was collapsing in a matter of weeks. Except it wasn't mine anymore. It was theirs, and they were completely helpless to stop the deterioration. They didn't have the knowledge or skills to fix it, and the one person who could help them was the person they'd betrayed and cast aside. Jennifer finally called from a different phone number that I didn't recognize. I decided to answer this time, curious to hear just how desperate she'd become. Her voice was shaking in a way I'd never heard before in all the years I'd known her. The confident, controlled tone she usually projected was completely gone, replaced by barely contained panic. She offered to pay me to fix the systems, whatever I wanted, name my price. I told her calmly that my price was simple and non-negotiable. Complete control of TechShield, with both her and Derek removed entirely from the company and stripped of all their shares. She actually had the audacity to say I was asking for too much, that the board would never agree to that her pride wouldn't allow her to just hand everything back to me. I told her then, I guess we're done here, and I hung up. That was the moment she sealed TechShield's fate. She could have saved something, could have admitted defeat and negotiated. But pride made her refuse. And that choice destroyed everything. Within days, TechShield officially filed for bankruptcy. The company that had been valued at over $1 billion just months before was now legally insolvent. Jennifer resigned as CEO amid massive scandal, her name now permanently associated with one of the most spectacular corporate failures in recent tech history. Derek completely disappeared from public view. No statements, no interviews, just gone. The board of directors dissolved. Major investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars. It was total collapse, and I had orchestrated every step. But I still wasn't finished. Mark Hartley, who'd been TechShield's largest investor, called me directly. His tone was measured, but I could hear the desperation underneath. He knew the company was dying and that I was the only person who potentially understood the systems well enough to salvage anything. He made me an offer. Full control, complete authority, if I'd come back and fix everything. I told him I had absolutely no interest in fixing TechShield, that as far as I was concerned, it was already dead and buried. He shifted his approach, suggesting a merger between TechShield and whatever new venture I was working on. Word had apparently gotten out in industry circles that I was building something called Cyber Fortress. I declined his merger proposal immediately. TechShield was a sinking ship, and I didn't need its baggage, its tainted reputation, or its dysfunctional corporate structure. But then Mark made a different offer, one that actually interested me. What if I simply bought TechShield's remaining assets? The patents, the intellectual property, the government contracts, everything of actual value that could be stripped out and absorbed into Cyber Fortress. He was asking $30 million. I countered with $15 million. We went back and forth. Eventually, we settled on $17 million for assets that had been worth literally billions just months before. It was the deal of the century. Just like that, everything Jennifer and Derek had stolen from me was mine again. Except now it was completely on my terms, with total control and no board to answer to. I spent the next 2 months systematically integrating TechShield's valuable assets into Cyber Fortress while discarding everything else. We took the useful patents and refined them. We absorbed the government contracts and renegotiated them under our terms. We rebranded everything completely, erasing any public connection to TechShield's name or reputation. The old company had to die completely for the new one to truly thrive. Rebecca had been doing incredible work behind the scenes, lining up meetings with former TechShield clients who were desperately searching for a reliable security solution after their systems had failed. When we officially launched Cyber Fortress to the public, the response was overwhelming beyond anything I'd anticipated. Within the first week, we'd signed contracts worth more than TechShield had managed in 6 months. Within the first month, we'd replaced virtually every major client TechShield had lost. The technology was better, our reputation was clean, and the industry was ready for exactly what we were offering. The media coverage was absolutely intense. Articles calling it the most brilliant business comeback in tech industry history. Some journalists framed it as revenge, others called it justice, some just focused on the impressive technology. I didn't particularly care how they characterized it. I called it rebuilding correctly, with the right people and the right principles. Jennifer tried to call me one last time. This was several months after everything had collapsed. She asked if there was any possible way back for her, if maybe we could work together again, if she could have some role in Cyber Fortress. She actually had the nerve to say we'd been good together once, as if our personal history meant anything after what she'd done. I told her very clearly that her biggest mistake was betraying someone who had genuinely cared about her, who had trusted her completely, who had built a life with her. Then I hung up and blocked her number permanently. 1 year, after being forced out of my own office with nothing but a cardboard box of personal items, I stood on stage at a major international tech conference. Behind me was a massive screen displaying the Cyber Fortress logo. The room was packed with journalists, investors, industry leaders, and potential clients. I talked about how the cybersecurity industry had been shaken by a company that failed catastrophically because it was built on lies, greed, and betrayal instead of actual innovation and integrity. But from those ashes, we'd built something stronger, something better, something that actually delivered on its promises and treated both clients and employees with respect. I ended my presentation with a line that got quoted in dozens of articles afterward. The best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's making sure they live long enough to watch you succeed beyond anything they could have imagined, completely without them. The applause was absolutely deafening. People standing, cheering, some actually approaching me afterward to shake my hand and tell me my story had inspired them. I looked out at that crowd and noticed who wasn't there. Jennifer wasn't there. Derek wasn't there. They'd become completely irrelevant, cautionary tales that people in the industry whispered about as perfect examples of what happens when greed overwhelms ethics. Today, Cyber Fortress is the leading cybersecurity firm in the entire industry. We have all the major government contracts, all the Fortune 500 clients, everything TechShield once had, and significantly more. But this time, it's built on loyalty, genuine competence, and real innovation. I have complete ownership with ironclad legal protections that prevent anyone from ever doing to me what Jennifer and Derek did. Marcus, Elena, Tony, and Rebecca are all senior partners with significant equity stakes. We built this together the right way, and nobody can take it from us. People still sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about what I did to TechShield, about sabotaging the company. The truth is, I genuinely don't see it as sabotage at all. I built that technology with my own hands, with my own mind, with years of my life. Jennifer and Derek stole something they fundamentally didn't understand and couldn't maintain. They thought they could just cut me out and everything would continue running perfectly because they saw the company as just an asset to be owned rather than a complex system that required deep expertise to maintain. That's not how sophisticated technology works. That's not how anything works at that level. I didn't destroy TechShield through some malicious attack. I just stopped being there to hold it together, and their complete incompetence did the rest. The strange thing is how much genuine peace I feel now. For months after the betrayal, I was consumed with anger, hurt, and a burning desire for revenge. Those emotions were completely valid, and they motivated me to work harder than I'd ever worked in my life. But building Cyber Fortress, working alongside people who actually valued loyalty and competence and integrity, that gradually healed something deep inside me that had been broken by the betrayal. Jennifer and Derek taught me brutal lessons about trust and about protecting yourself in business, but they also inadvertently gave me the motivation and freedom to build something even better than what I'd had before. Last month, I drove past TechShield's old headquarters building just because I was in that part of the city. The building is still standing, but it's completely empty now, dark windows looking out over the city like a monument to corporate failure and hubris. I sat in my car for a few minutes, thinking about everything that had happened in that building. All the late nights I'd spent there building something I thought would last forever. All the dreams and efforts and sacrifices. But I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad. I just felt grateful that their betrayal had ultimately freed me to build something better, something that was truly mine in every sense. So that's my entire story. I lost everything to the two people I trusted most in the world. And then I systematically took it all back on my own terms, better than before. TechShield is gone, erased from existence. Jennifer's legal career never recovered from the scandal. Derek left the tech industry entirely. And me? I'm standing at the top of the industry again, except this time I built it smarter, stronger, and with people who actually deserve to be part of it.